The man holding the wine bottle looked like someone's tired dad. He wasn't. When four armed men surrounded the most powerful woman in Silicon Valley outside a restaurant that charged $300 for a steak, everybody froze. Everybody except the waiter. In 11 seconds, 11, Daniel Ward put three of them on the pavement and had the fourth begging. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody understood what they'd just witnessed. The woman he saved couldn't stop thinking about it. And the men who sent those attackers? They were already sending more. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow along, because this story is just getting started, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been made 6 weeks in advance. Table 9 at Ardent, a restaurant tucked into the ground floor of a glass tower in downtown San Francisco, was the kind of place where people came to close deals worth more than most people made in a decade. The lighting was amber and low. The tablecloths were real linen. The wine list was bound in leather that smelled like money, and the sommelier, a thin man named Jeffrey, who had been working the floor for 11 years, moved between tables like a diplomat at a state dinner. Daniel Ward was not Jeffrey. Daniel worked the back section, the tables closest to the kitchen, where the ventilation wasn't quite right and the noise from the pass-through made it hard to hear orders clearly. He had been at Ardent for 14 months. He was good at his job, precise, quiet, never rattled. And his manager, a stressed woman named Karen, who chewed antacids like candy, had once told him he was the most unflappable server she'd ever hired. She meant it as a compliment. He took it as a fact. He was 37 years old, 5'11", with the kind of build that people described as fit, without knowing exactly why. His hands were calloused in specific places. He moved through crowded rooms in a way that didn't draw attention, but somehow never bumped into anything. His eyes, a flat gray-green, had the habit of tracking exits without meaning to. He'd been trying to break that habit for years. He hadn't managed it yet. At 6:40 on a Thursday evening, he was carrying a tray of appetizers toward table 11 when his phone buzzed in his apron pocket. He already knew what the text said before he read it. Ava's school had a parent-teacher conference next Thursday, and he'd forgotten to put it in the calendar. Again. He'd been forgetting things lately. Not important things, not dangerous things, just the ordinary admin of being a person in the world. It was a strange kind of progress, forgetting things. It meant his brain had finally accepted that there was nothing more urgent to track. He set down the tray, smiled at the couple at table 11, described the burrata with the level of genuine engagement that Karen always asked for, and took their order. Then he went back to the kitchen, stuck his phone in his locker, and forgot about the text. The restaurant filled up by 7:30. Thursdays were always busy. The pre-weekend crowd, the expense account dinners, the couples who'd made reservations back when they were still trying. Daniel worked his section without complaint, refilled water glasses before people noticed they were low, and talked down a kitchen crisis when the wrong entree came up for table 12. The cook responsible was a 22-year-old named Marco, who had a habit of panic sweating. Daniel had talked him through worse. "It's fine," Daniel told him, voice low, standing at the pass. "Take the plate back. Fix it. Don't rush. Rushing makes more mistakes." "She's already been waiting 20 minutes. She'll wait 5 more. Go." Marco went. Daniel went back to his tables. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Taxis, pedestrians, the ambient hum of a place that never fully stopped. Olivia Miller arrived at 8:15. He didn't know who she was when she walked in. She was escorted to table 4, which was Jeffrey's section, and Daniel only noticed her the way he noticed most things in the restaurant. Briefly, then not at all. She was in her early 30s, wearing a dark blazer over a simple blouse, and she moved with the particular kind of confidence that didn't announce itself. She sat down alone, declined the wine menu at first, then changed her mind. She had the look of someone who'd been in back-to-back meetings since 8 in the morning and had finally exhaled. He found out her name later from Karen, who mentioned it in the tone people use when they expect you to recognize it. He didn't. "Olivia Miller," Karen said again, slower, like that would help. "Novatech? She's on the cover of Wired literally this month." "I don't read Wired," Daniel said. Karen stared at him for a moment. "Sometimes I can't tell if you're joking. I'm not joking. He went back to work. Table 9 needed the check. Table 13 had a food allergy issue that needed to be escalated to the kitchen. By the time he'd sorted both, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and the restaurant was beginning its slow exhale toward closing time. The lull when the last orders were in and the energy dropped by 20 degrees. He was restocking the service station near the back hall when he heard the door. Not the front door. The side exit, the one that opened onto the service alley along the east side of the building. Most people didn't know it existed. Staff used it for smoke breaks and trash runs. It had a slow hydraulic hinge and made a specific sound when it opened. A soft mechanical sigh followed by the low rush of outside air. Someone had just used it from the inside. Daniel didn't move for a moment. He just processed the sound. Then he checked the time. 9:12. The trash run wasn't until 9:45. Nobody was on a scheduled break. He picked up a bus tray. Something to hold in his hands, something that made sense in his hands, and walked toward the back hallway. He heard voices before he reached the door. One was a woman's, controlled, but with the specific compression of someone trying not to let their voice shake. The other was a man's, low, deliberate, the cadence of someone who was used to being listened to because the alternative was unpleasant. Just come with us. This doesn't have to be difficult. I don't know what you think you're... Ms. Miller. A pause. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Daniel set the bus tray down on a shelf without making a sound. He moved to the door, cracked it 2 inches, and looked. The service alley was narrow, maybe 12 feet wide, flanked on one side by the restaurant's exterior wall and on the other by a concrete retaining structure. Sodium lights above the loading dock threw yellow light over the scene. There were 4 of them. They had positioned themselves in a loose diamond formation around Olivia Miller, who had her back to the restaurant wall. She was holding her phone, had been trying to make a call, was Daniel's read, and one of the men had just taken it from her hand. Smooth, practiced, no drama, like he'd done it before. The 4 men were wearing plain clothes. 2 were big, 6'1", 6'2", the kind of big that came from a gym and a protein budget, not from farm work. The other 2 were leaner, more precise in their movements. One of them, the one talking, had a hand resting casually near his jacket opening. He hadn't drawn anything, but the message was clear. These weren't muggers. Muggers didn't work in formation. They didn't speak in that tone, didn't take phones without checking them for cash. These were professionals, contract, private sector, some intelligence flavor he couldn't immediately identify. Well-funded, organized, patient. Daniel stood in the doorway for 2 seconds. He ran a fast inventory of what he had. The alley, 12 feet wide, 4 targets, distances, about 8 feet to the nearest one. A big guy with his back to the door, roughly 15 feet to the one doing the talking, maybe 20 feet to the far pair. He had surprise, which was worth more than most people understood. He had a service entrance with a hydraulic hinge he could control. He had a bus tray. He had a rack of empty wine bottles on the shelf to his left. He picked up one of the wine bottles. Sommelier stock. Empty. Heavy borosilicate glass. He held it by the neck. Then he opened the door. The big man closest to him turned at the sound. He had just enough time to register surprise, a waiter, a bottle, what the hell, before Daniel stepped into him. He used the man's own turning momentum, let the shoulder rotation carry the man's head down and to the left, and brought the base of the bottle hard against the junction of neck and collarbone. Not the temple. Not the skull. The collarbone junction, because that kind of impact dropped someone without killing them, and Daniel had spent a long time training himself to know the difference. The man went down immediately and noisily, which was intentional. Daniel wanted the others to hear it. They did. They turned. The lean one closest to Olivia moved toward him, and Daniel was already moving too, but differently. He let the man come, watched his hands, clocked the trajectory, and stepped inside the initial reach, turning his shoulder into the man's chest rather than away from it. It was a confusion move, counterintuitive, and it worked the way counterintuitive moves always worked against people who had trained for the expected response. The man grabbed at air. Daniel's elbow went up and back. Contact. The man staggered. The big second one hit Daniel from the right. A real hit. Solid. The man's forearm catching him across the shoulder and spinning him a half step to the side. Daniel's back went against the wall. He felt the impact in his teeth. The man was fast for his size, faster than Daniel had estimated, and he came back immediately with a follow-up that Daniel barely managed to redirect, catching the man's wrist and using the forward energy to introduce the man's face to the exterior wall of the restaurant. Brick. The man did not get back up. That left the talker and one other. The talker had moved back. He had Olivia by the arm, not violently, but firmly, and he had something in his free hand now, a phone, not a weapon. He was making a call. The fourth man had positioned himself between Daniel and the talker, and he had his jacket pushed back, and Daniel could see what was on his hip. Everyone went still. Daniel stood in the alley. His shoulder hurt. His tie was crooked. He was still holding the wine bottle, though it had cracked at the base sometime in the last 30 seconds. He didn't remember exactly when. The fourth man and Daniel looked at each other. "Walk away," the man said. His voice was flat, professional. "This doesn't involve you." Daniel didn't say anything. "Walk away," the man said again. Last time. Daniel was already reading the alley, the distance, the angle, the talker behind with Olivia's arm, the light above the loading dock, the door he'd come through, still closing on its hydraulic hinge. "Here's the thing," Daniel said, and his voice came out easy, the voice he used when Ava was scared and he was trying to keep her calm, even when he wasn't sure things were fine. "You're going to let go of her arm. A beat. Or," the man said, "or I'm going to make you." The man reached for his hip. He was fast. Daniel was faster. Not because of some innate gift, because he had spent 8 years being made faster by people who understood that speed was a perishable thing and you had to sharpen it constantly. He closed the distance in 3 steps, got inside the draw, controlled the wrist, redirected. The weapon discharged once into the concrete above the loading dock, a sound like a thunderclap in the tight alley that probably woke people on 3 floors of the adjacent building. Then it was in Daniel's hand. He looked at the talker. The talker released Olivia's arm. He said something in a language Daniel didn't immediately place, Eastern European possibly, maybe Balkan, into his phone. Then he put the phone away and looked at Daniel with an expression that wasn't fear. It was evaluation, the careful professional inventory of a man who had just reclassified his situation. "Who are you?" the talker said. Daniel picked up his bus tray from where he'd dropped it near the door. He checked Olivia. She was shaking slightly, had one hand pressed against the wall, but she was upright and she hadn't been touched beyond the arm grab. He made a visual check of all 4 men. Down, down, standing, standing. The ones down were breathing. The one with the recently empty holster had backed against the retaining wall. He cleared the magazine from the weapon, pocketed the round that had chambered, and set the empty pistol on the lid of the trash container by the loading dock. "You need to call the police," he told Olivia. She stared at him. Her eyes were dark brown, sharp, the eyes of someone who spent their life processing information and was currently processing something they didn't have a category for. "You're the waiter," she said. "Yes." "You just—" She looked at the 2 men on the ground, the one against the retaining wall, the one with the empty holster. "You need to call the police," Daniel said again. "Tell them what happened. Don't mention me if you can avoid it." He paused. "Or mention me, whatever you think is right. I just need to get back inside before Karen notices I've been gone too long." "Karen," Olivia repeated. "My manager." He went back through the side door. The hydraulic hinge sighed shut behind him. He set the bus tray on the shelf, straightened his tie in the small mirror near the staff bathroom, and went back to the floor. Table 13's dessert order was ready. He picked it up and carried it out. He was pouring water for an older couple at table 8 when he heard the first sirens, distant and growing closer. He didn't look up. Karen found him 20 minutes later in the break room, eating the staff meal he'd missed earlier. Pasta from the day's batch, a little dry, with a side of bread he'd taken without asking, and would tell her about later if she noticed. His tie was straight. His hands were steady. There was a faint bruise forming on his shoulder where the big second man had connected, but his jacket covered it. "Police are outside," Karen said. "Something happened in the side alley. You know anything about that?" "No," Daniel said. She looked at him for a long moment. Karen was not a stupid woman. She noticed things, who was late, whose side work was done, which tables were going to be problems before the problem started. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at things she'd decided were above her pay grade. "Okay," she said. She got herself a coffee from the machine and left. Daniel finished his pasta. He thought about the talker's expression, that careful, professional reclassification, and the phone call the man had been making when Daniel took the weapon away from the fourth, the call that had completed. Someone, somewhere, had heard what happened in that alley. He thought about Ava, who was home with Mrs. Petrovic from across the hall, and who had a science project due Friday that they hadn't started yet. He threw away his paper plate, washed his hands, and went back out to close his tables. The sirens were still going outside. He ignored them the way he'd trained himself to ignore most things that weren't the immediate task in front of him. He'd spent years getting good at that, folding the world down to its smallest useful shape. Breakfast, homework, tables to clear, glasses to fill. He thought about the way Olivia Miller had looked at him in the alley. Not grateful, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The expression of someone who had just seen a door open in a wall they thought was solid. He picked up the last check of the night and carried it to table 15. Outside, the sirens stopped. The police took statements for 2 hours. Olivia sat in the back of a black SUV that her head of security, a man named Reyes, had brought around the moment she called him from the alley. The paramedic who checked her out said her blood pressure was elevated and her left forearm had bruising from where the man had grabbed her, and that was all. Physically, she was fine. She kept telling people she was fine. She wasn't sure she was fine. What she kept seeing every time she closed her eyes was the speed, not the violence of it. She'd watched security footage from her company's building before, had seen what physical altercations looked like on camera. The messy scramble of it, the ugliness. This had not looked like that. This had looked like something she didn't have a word for. The waiter had moved through those 4 men the way water moves through a blocked drain, not fighting the obstacle so much as finding every point where resistance was lowest and using it. In 11 seconds, maybe 12, 4 professional men had been removed from the situation, and then he'd gone back inside to finish his shift. "The waiter," she said to Reyes, who was sitting across from her in the SUV with a tablet on his knee. "The one who intervened. What do we know?" Reyes looked up. He had the focused, careful expression of a man who had worked personal security long enough to know that questions from a principal after an incident were rarely simple. Still working on it, he gave the first responding officers his name, Daniel Ward, employed at Ardent for 14 months. "Beyond that, we're pulling." "Pull faster," she said. Reyes pulled faster. By midnight, he had a surface file, driver's license, work history, the sparse digital footprint of a man who either didn't use social media or had deliberately removed himself from it. By 1 a.m, when Olivia was back in her apartment on the 41st floor with a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink, Reyes called her with something that made him pause in a way she'd never heard him pause before. "He was Navy," Reyes said. "I mean, he was really Navy." "What does that mean?" Another pause. "SEAL. Team 6. Multiple combat deployments. His record is partially classified, which I can't get into tonight, but what's accessible, Miss Miller, this guy has commendations that most active operators retire without seeing once. He separated from service 7 years ago. After that, nothing. He just stopped." Olivia looked at her reflection in the dark floor-to-ceiling window. 41 floors below, the city was still going, indifferent and lit up. "Where does he live?" she said. "I'm not going to give you his home address." "Reyes." "I'll set up a meeting," he said firmly. "If you want one. I'll make contact through the restaurant and do it properly. But I'm not giving you his home address at 1 a.m. after you just got assaulted." She knew he was right. She didn't say so. She set her phone down and stood at the window for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a man who had spent years making himself invisible and then, in 11 seconds, had made himself the most visible person in that alley. Daniel found out about the meeting request the next morning through Karen, who delivered it with the energy of someone who had been awake too long and was done pretending she understood what was happening in her restaurant. "There's a man outside," she said, finding Daniel in the walk-in where he was pulling produce for the lunch mise en place. "In a very nice car. He says he works for Olivia Miller and that she'd like to speak with you. At your convenience. She used air quotes around the last two words, which Daniel noted. Tell him I'm working, Daniel said. Daniel? I'm working, Karen. I'm literally in the walk-in right now. She made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a word. He said she'd like to speak with you today. He said it's important. Daniel straightened up with a flat of cherry tomatoes under his arm. He looked at Karen, who was standing in the doorway of the walk-in with her arms crossed and her antacid tin in her right hand. She was rolling it between her fingers without opening it, which meant she was more unsettled than she was showing. Did the police talk to you this morning? He asked. Briefly, they said 4 men were found in the alley. 2 needed medical attention. The police aren't treating you as anything other than a witness. She looked at him carefully. They described what you did as, and I'm quoting the officer, significant intervention. Okay. Daniel, what the hell? He shifted the flat of tomatoes to his other arm. I should get these prepped before the lunch rush. Daniel. Karen, I'm going to go prep these tomatoes, and I'm going to work my shift, and then I'm going to go pick up my daughter from school. If the man outside still wants to talk after my shift, he can talk then. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him out of the walk-in. He worked the lunch shift. He prepped his tomatoes. He refilled water glasses and described the day's specials, and handled a complaint about the temperature of a soup that was genuinely not cold, just not scalding, and he talked Marco down from another minor kitchen crisis involving a poorly timed risotto. He did all of it the same way he always did all of it, with the steady, low-key attention that Karen had noted as his defining professional quality, except that his shoulder still ached from where the big man had connected, and he kept his left arm slightly extended when he carried heavy trays to compensate for the joint stiffness. At 3:15, he clocked out, changed into his street clothes in the break room, and walked out the front. The man waiting by the car was mid-40s, ex-military in the posture, if not the outfit, with the kind of settled watchfulness that Daniel recognized immediately. Not a threat. Assessment, not aggression. He had a tablet under his arm, and he looked at Daniel the way someone looks at a file they've been reading all morning and are now seeing in person for the first time. Mr. Ward, the man said, I'm Marcus Reyes, Ms. Miller's head of security. I know what you are, Daniel said. Not unkind, just factual. Reyes absorbed this without reacting. She'd like to meet with you. I figured. Daniel looked at the car. Black, recent model, the kind of window tint that said corporate budget, not personal preference. Where? Her office. Or somewhere else if you prefer. She wanted to give you the option. Daniel thought about it for a moment. He had to pick Ava up at 4 misses. Petrovich could do it in a pinch, but Ava didn't like pinches, and after the science project debacle earlier in the week, he owed her some consistency. He checked the time. I need to pick up my daughter at 4, he said. I can give her 45 minutes. Reyes nodded. That works. Novatech's San Francisco offices occupied 4 floors of a building in Soma that had been designed to look effortless and probably cost a ludicrous amount of money to make look that way. The lobby had living walls and natural light and the particular hum of a place full of people who believed genuinely that what they were doing mattered. Daniel had been in enough government facilities and military installations to recognize the difference between organizations that projected importance and organizations that had actually accumulated it. This was the latter. Olivia Miller met him on the 32nd floor, in a conference room that had a glass wall overlooking the bay. She was dressed differently than she had been the night before, more corporate, a charcoal blazer over a white shirt. But she had the same quality he'd noticed in the alley, that compressed internal focus, like she was processing 3 things simultaneously and was too experienced to let it show on her face. She stood when he came in. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, and she held it a half-second longer than strictly necessary, which wasn't a power move. It was the grip of someone who wanted to look at you properly before she let go. Thank you for coming, she said. Sit down. Can I get you anything? I'm fine. They sat across from each other at the end of the long conference table. Reyes positioned himself near the door, which Daniel noted and catalogued and then set aside. I wanted to thank you in person, Olivia said. What you did last night. You don't have to, Daniel said. I know I don't have to. She looked at him steadily. I want to. He let that sit for a moment. Okay. Reyes pulled some background on you, she said, not apologetically. Direct, the way someone is direct, when they've decided that managing information is less useful than putting it on the table. Navy SEAL, Team 6. 7 years ago, you separated from service and basically disappeared. I didn't disappear, Daniel said. I moved to Oakland. I got a job. I'm raising my daughter. That's not disappearing. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, he agreed. I just don't think the framing is accurate. I made a choice. What kind of choice? He looked at her. It wasn't a hostile look. It was the look of a man who was deciding in real time how much of a thing was relevant to share with a stranger. The kind where you look at the life you've been living and decide that the parts of it you can still change are worth changing. She was quiet for a moment. He got the impression she was filing that away, turning it over, letting it mean something. The men last night, she said. What did you make of them? Professional. Private sector contract, probably. Not domestics. The one making the call was using a phrase structure I've heard in Eastern Balkan contexts. But that's a guess. I'm not a linguist. He paused. They weren't trying to hurt you. The grip on your arm was control positioning, not aggression. They wanted to move you somewhere. That matches what the police are thinking, she said. Or what Reyes is thinking anyway. The police are working with what they have. Which isn't much, Daniel said, because none of the four will talk. Correct. She folded her hands on the table. Her nails were short, unpolished. Not neglect, he thought, just practicality. Last night wasn't the first incident. 3 months ago, once of my senior engineers had his car broken into and a drive was stolen. We thought it was a random theft until we realized what was on the drive. 6 weeks ago, someone accessed an external server we use for overflow storage. Small data, obscure pathway, the kind of breach that's designed to look like background noise. She stopped. It's not background noise. No, Daniel said. It's not. They're after the technology my company has been developing. We've been working on an energy storage system, a battery architecture, essentially, but with performance specs that don't currently exist in the commercial market. If it works at scale, it changes the economic math on renewable infrastructure significantly. We're 18 months from filing the final patents. And someone doesn't want you to file. Someone wants to own it instead, she said, or bury it. Depending on who they're working for, the motivations might be different, but the method is the same. She looked at him directly. I don't know who I'm dealing with yet. That's the problem. My security team is good at what they do, but this is outside the profile of what they've handled before. Last night told me these people are willing to escalate to personal physical risk. Daniel looked at his hands on the table. His knuckles were slightly bruised from the night before, which he'd addressed with ice wrapped in a kitchen towel during his break. Nothing serious. He was aware of Reyes near the door, still, unhurried, listening without appearing to listen. You want help? Daniel said. I want someone who knows how to read what I'm looking at, she said. Reyes is excellent, but you read those 4 men in 2 seconds and responded in a way that my entire security apparatus didn't. That's not a knock on Reyes. You have a different kind of training. I'm a waiter, Daniel said. You're a waiter who took 4 contract professionals apart with a wine bottle and an empty tray. 1 wine bottle, he said. The tray was already set down. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than that, like a smile that had thought about it and decided to only go halfway. Will you help me? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the glass wall at the bay, which was gray and flat under the afternoon overcast. He thought about Ava, who had her science project due tomorrow, who had eaten cereal for dinner twice this week because he'd been too tired to cook real food, who had asked him last Sunday while they were watching a movie if he ever missed his old job, and to whom he had said without hesitation, no. I can't be what I used to be, he said. I want to be clear about that. I have a daughter. She is the thing I come home to every night, and I am not going to risk that. I understand. I don't think you do yet, he said, not harshly. But okay. Let me think about it. She nodded. She didn't push. He gave her credit for that. He picked Ava up 7 minutes late, which she registered with the specific theatrical sigh of a 9-year-old who has been waiting in the pickup line 1 minute past the agreed time. She was wearing her backpack on both straps, which she only did when she was tired, and she had a smudge of blue paint on her left wrist from art class that she hadn't noticed yet. You're late, she said, climbing into the passenger seat with the gravity of a judge reading a sentence. 7 minutes. 7 minutes is late. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. She considered this, the way she considered most apologies, not softening immediately because she believed in accountability, which she had developed at age 6 and had shown no signs of abandoning. Then she put on her seatbelt and said, Mrs. Garner said my science report on migration patterns was really good. Yeah? She said it showed independent thinking. Ava paused. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I think it's a compliment. It's definitely a compliment. Okay? She looked out the window at the pickup line traffic. What's for dinner? Real food, he said. I'm making actual food tonight. Like what? Like chicken and rice. With the sauce. The lemon one or the other one? The lemon one. She accepted this with the solemnity of a treaty being signed. Okay, that's fine. He drove. The afternoon traffic was the usual grinding, horn-heavy crawl, and Ava put her earbuds in and listened to something she'd described as a podcast about animals that are surprisingly dangerous, which had been her rotation for the past 3 weeks. Daniel navigated the streets in the half-automatic way he navigated everything, monitoring the mirrors without thinking about it, tracking the vehicles that had been behind him since the off-ramp, noting which ones moved the way traffic moved and which ones moved in relation to him specifically. One of them moved in relation to him specifically. It was a gray sedan, nothing distinctive, driven by someone who was good at not being seen. They'd been 2 cars back since he pulled out of the school pickup, and they'd stayed 2 cars back through 3 turns that a following vehicle following traffic wouldn't have made. The 3rd turn, especially, was wrong. Daniel had gone 3 blocks out of his way specifically to test it, a route variation that made no geographic sense unless you were going somewhere he wasn't going. The gray sedan had followed. He didn't say anything to Ava. He adjusted his mirror angle slightly and drove home the long way, checking the sedan at each turn. By the time he pulled into their parking structure, the sedan was gone, had peeled off 2 blocks back, which meant whoever was driving it was experienced enough to know that parking structures were traps, and had made the call to withdraw before getting boxed. Experienced, disciplined, the same organization or a connected one. He parked. He helped Ava with her backpack even though she was 9 and didn't need help with her backpack, and he walked her through the lobby and into the elevator and down the hallway to their apartment door with the quiet, unhurried attentiveness of a man who was counting doorways and measuring sightlines and doing all of it in a way that looked exactly like a tired dad walking his kid home from school. Inside, with the door locked, he put on the chicken. Ava sat at the kitchen table with her homework. She narrated it as she did it. This was a habit she'd had since kindergarten and showed no signs of stopping. And Daniel half listened while he worked, slicing lemon, checking the rice, the familiar domestic choreography of a weeknight that looked, from the outside, like a completely ordinary life. He thought about the gray sedan, about the 4 men in the alley, about the phone call the talker had made before Daniel took the weapon away, the call that had completed, that had gone somewhere, that had told someone something. Olivia Miller had said, the attack wasn't random. What she hadn't said, but what Daniel had understood from the shape of the conversation, was this. They'd been watching her for a while, and now they'd seen who had intervened, which meant they were already asking the same question Olivia had asked, already pulling the same file Reyes had pulled, already reaching the same answer. He set the chicken in the pan. The oil popped. Dad? Ava said from behind her math worksheet. Yeah. Are you okay? He looked at her over his shoulder. She was 9 years old with her mother's dark hair and his habit of going very still when she was thinking hard. She was watching him with an expression that was too grown up for the face it was sitting on. "I'm fine," he said. "You're doing that thing," she said. "What thing?" "The quiet thing. Where you get really quiet and you think you're being normal, but you're not being normal. You're just being quiet." She looked back at her worksheet. "It's okay. You don't have to tell me." He turned back to the stove. He moved the chicken in the pan. He thought about the gray sedan. He thought about the fact that they'd been behind him since the school pickup, which meant they knew where Ava went to school, which meant the calculation he'd been running about keeping his home life sealed off from whatever Olivia Miller was dealing with had just changed shape without his permission. He thought about the last time the world had reached into his ordinary life and rearranged it. He thought about the hospital room 7 years ago, and the specific quality of silence that a room has when the machines stop and the only sound left is your own breathing. The rice needed attention. He gave it attention. After dinner, after homework, after Ava had brushed her teeth with the thoroughness of someone who had recently had her first cavity and was still processing the betrayal of it, after he'd sat on the edge of her bed while she did what she described as reviewing her day, a habit she'd invented herself at age 7, a running inventory of what had been good and bad and confusing, delivered with the editorial focus of a journalist filing a report. After all of that, after the light was off and her breathing had gone slow and even, Daniel went and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He didn't turn on a light. He sat in the dark and he looked at his hands and he thought about his wife, Sarah, who had told him once, in the kitchen of the small house they'd rented in Virginia Beach, that the thing she loved most about him was that he always knew what the right thing to do was. She'd said it like it was a gift. He'd never been sure it was. Sarah, who had died in a car accident on a wet Tuesday morning while he was 7,000 miles away on an operation he still couldn't talk about, and who had left him a daughter and a name and the specific permanent geography of grief, the way it doesn't go away, just shifts, becomes the thing you navigate around rather than the thing you're drowning in. He thought about the gray sedan. He thought about Ava saying, "It's okay, you don't have to tell me." He pulled out his phone. He found the number Reyes had given him before he left Novatech. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he sent a text that said, "I have some conditions. If Miller agrees to them, I'll help." The response came back in 4 minutes. One word from Reyes. "Name them." Daniel looked up at the kitchen ceiling. In the other room, Ava was asleep, probably dreaming about migration patterns or surprisingly dangerous animals, safe in the ordinary dark of a life he had built around her with everything he had. He typed out his conditions. He sent them. Then he got up, washed the dinner dishes, and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. But when he didn't dream about the alley or the 4 men or the weight of the weapon in his hand. He dreamed about the drive home, the gray sedan 2 cars back, the specific patience of whatever was coming, and the part of him that had been sleeping for 7 years, quiet and still as water under ice, beginning, without his permission, to wake up. His conditions were 3. The first, Ava's school, daily routine, and home address would be treated as classified information within Novatech's security operation. Nobody below Reyes's direct clearance would have access to it. The second, Daniel would work as a consultant, not an employee, which meant he answered to nobody's chain of command and reserved the right to withdraw if the situation evolved in a direction he couldn't protect Ava from. The third, if at any point Daniel determined that continuing posed a direct physical risk to his daughter, the arrangement ended immediately. No argument, no negotiation. Olivia had agreed to all 3 without counter-offering. Reyes had called to confirm at 7:15 the next morning, while Daniel was making Ava's lunch: peanut butter, no jelly, apple slices, the small bag of pretzels she'd decided were her favorite sometime around February and had not wavered from since. "She read your conditions last night," Reyes said. "She said they were reasonable." "They are reasonable," Daniel said. "She also said—" A pause. The kind of pause that meant someone was deciding whether to pass along the next part. "She said she respects that your daughter is your first priority. She wanted you to know that." Daniel put the lid on the lunch container. "Okay. That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say, Reyes?" Another pause. Shorter. "Nothing. I'll text you the access details for the building. You can start whenever you're ready. He dropped Ava at school, watched her walk through the front doors, watched the doors close, stood at the curb for an extra 30 seconds, checking the street in both directions, and then drove to Novatech. He spent the first 2 days doing nothing but looking. Reyes gave him a temporary access badge and a desk in a windowless room adjacent to the main security operations center, and Daniel sat at that desk and read everything. The incident reports from the server breach 6 weeks ago, the engineer's car break-in 3 months back, the physical security logs for the building going back 8 months, the access records for the research floors, the vendor contracts, the visitor logs. He read all of it slowly and carefully, the way he used to read terrain maps before an operation. Not looking for a specific thing yet, just letting the shape of the place settle into him, learning where the edges were, finding the places where things didn't quite line up. On the second afternoon, he found the first one. It was small, an access log discrepancy in the research wing, a badge swipe for a door that should have required two-person authorization at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday 6 weeks ago, the same night as the server breach. One badge, one entry, one exit. 22 minutes later, the badge belonged to a Dr. Elliot Marsh, listed as Novatech's lead research scientist on the energy storage project. Daniel pulled Marsh's personnel file. PhD from MIT, hired 4 years ago, performance reviews that were uniformly excellent in that slightly airless way that institutional performance reviews always were. No disciplinary history. No unusual access requests. The kind of file that said nothing because it was written to say nothing. He looked at the log entry again. 2:47 in the morning. He found Reyes in the operations center. "Tell me about Elliot Marsh," he said. Reyes looked up from his monitor. "What about him? Who runs background on your research staff?" "We do an initial check at hire and annually after that. Marsh is clean." "He was in the research wing at 2:47 the night of the server breach," Daniel said. "One badge, no partner. Your two-person protocol for that wing, is it enforced or is it a policy that exists on paper?" Reyes's expression shifted, not defensively. He was too professional for that, but with the particular focused attention of someone recalibrating. "It's enforced by the system. If a door requires two-person, a single badge shouldn't have opened it." "And yet," Daniel said. Reyes turned back to his monitor and started pulling. Daniel waited. After 4 minutes, Reyes sat back in his chair with the particular posture of a man who had just found something he didn't want to have found. The two-person requirement for that door was suspended for a 14-minute window that night, listed as a system maintenance override. Who authorized the override? The authorization code is assigned to Building Systems Administration. He pulled up another screen. But Building Systems had no scheduled maintenance that night, and the administrator whose code was used... He stopped. "Was off-site," Daniel said. "Was in Denver," Reyes said quietly. "For a family event." He flew back the next day. They looked at each other. "Someone used his code remotely," Daniel said. "Or someone had access to his credentials. Either way, that door didn't open itself, and Marsh went through it alone at 2:47 in the morning on the night someone else was in your external server." He paused. "I need to talk to Marsh." "If he's involved, I don't think he's the inside man," Daniel said. "I think he's being used by one. Those are different things, and if you go at him wrong, you'll lose whatever he knows." Reyes considered this. "How do you want to do it?" "Quietly," Daniel said. "Just me." He found Elliot Marsh in the lab on the 29th floor at a workstation surrounded by the particular organized chaos of a scientist who was either brilliant or completely incapable of filing. Possibly both. Marsh was 44, slight, with the kind of pallor that accumulated from spending most of your waking hours under fluorescent light. He had reading glasses pushed up on his head and a coffee mug that said something Daniel couldn't read from the doorway. Daniel knocked on the open door. Marsh looked up, clocked the unfamiliar face with a visitor badge, and settled into the defensive attention of someone who had recently been visited by several people he didn't want to see. "Dr. Marsh, I'm Daniel Ward. I'm doing a security review for the company." "Another one," Marsh said. It wasn't a question. "Another one," Daniel agreed. He came in without being invited, which he knew was a pressure move and did it anyway, and sat in the chair across from Marsh's workstation. I wanted to ask you about a few things informally, if that's okay. Sure. Marsh's voice was careful, flat in a way that had been constructed to sound neutral. Daniel had heard that specific flatness before, in people who were holding something that was crushing them and had decided that the only way to carry it was to stop feeling the weight. How long have you been working on the battery project? Daniel asked. 4 years, since I was hired. You like the work? Marsh looked at him with the particular weariness of someone who has been asked performative questions before more uncomfortable ones. Yes, I like the work. It's important work. I imagine it's stressful, being that close to something significant and knowing how many people would like to get their hands on it. It's science, Marsh said. The stress is mostly about the science, not about... He stopped. Not about what? Daniel said. Marsh picked up his coffee mug, looked into it, set it back down. His hands were not quite steady. Daniel noticed this, noted it, and decided that the gentler approach was not going to get them to the truth faster than the direct one. Dr. Marsh, he said, I'm not here because I think you're the problem. I'm here because I think you know what the problem is and you've been carrying it by yourself for a while, and I think that's been making things significantly worse for you. Marsh looked up from his mug. I know about the 247 access, Daniel said. I know about the server breach. I know the timing lines up in a way that someone would eventually notice, and I think you've been waiting for someone to notice because you couldn't figure out how to bring it to anyone yourself. The silence in the lab had a specific quality, not empty, but pressurized, like the moment before a weather system breaks. If I tell you something, Marsh said, and his voice had changed, lost the constructed flatness, gone thin and real underneath it. If I tell you, what happens to me? That depends on what you tell me, Daniel said. But I'll be straight with you. My job right now is to find out what's happening and stop it. My job is not to put you in a room somewhere. If you were coerced, if someone had something over you, that changes the shape of this significantly. Marsh took off his glasses from the top of his head and set them on the desk. Without them, his face looked younger and more tired at the same time. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, the look of a man running a risk calculation he'd been running for weeks and had been unable to resolve. My daughter, he said finally. She's 18. She's in her first year at Berkeley. He stopped, swallowed. About 4 months ago, I started receiving messages. No sender, untraceable. I had a friend in IT look. He said the originating server was a ghost address. The messages said they were watching her. They sent me photos. Nothing was done to her. She didn't know. They were just photos. Of her walking to class. Of her at a coffee shop. Just photos. To show me they could. Daniel waited. He didn't react. Reacting would have closed Marsh up, and there was more. They told me what they wanted, Marsh said. They wanted access to specific sections of the research database. They wanted documentation on the battery architecture, not the final specs, not the complete system, but certain subsections. They said if I cooperated, they'd stop. They said if I went to security, they'd... He stopped again. His jaw was tight. They were very specific about what they said they'd do. And you cooperated, Daniel said. I thought it would end. Marsh's voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly, just for a moment, and then he closed it back up the way you close a door you meant to leave open. I thought if I gave them one thing, they'd... He shook his head. It didn't end. They came back. Different requests, same method. And I didn't know how to... Who else knew? Daniel said. Nobody here. He looked at the workstation. I thought about going to the police, but the messages were very clear about what would happen. And I thought about going to Ms. Miller, but I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if whoever was doing this was inside the company. They are, Daniel said. Someone inside helped them. Not you. Someone else. That's what I'm here to find. Marsh looked at him. What happens to my daughter? Right now, today, she's okay, Daniel said. If you work with me, with the security team here, we can put eyes on her. Not in a way she'd notice. Just coverage. But Dr. Marsh, I need you to understand that the only way this actually ends is if we find who's behind it and take away their ability to threaten you. Giving them what they want isn't going to stop them. It's going to give them leverage to ask for more. I know, Marsh said. I knew that at the beginning. He looked at his hands. She's my kid. Yeah, Daniel said. I know. There was a moment between them. Not warm exactly. Not the warmth of people who knew each other, but the specific recognition of two men who had been in different versions of the same trapped position. Daniel thought about the gray sedan 2 cars behind him on the drive home from Ava's school. He thought about standing at Ava's bedroom door in the dark, listening to her breathe. Okay, Marsh said. What do you need from me? What Daniel needed was a record. Everything Marsh had, the ghost address messages, the specific requests, the data he'd provided, the access methods they'd told him to use, the timing of every exchange. Marsh had kept none of it, partly from fear and partly because he'd been told to keep none of it, which itself was information. Organizations that demanded clean exchanges were organizations that had been caught before and had learned from it. Daniel spent the rest of that day and all of the next building what he could from what Marsh remembered, cross-referencing it against the access logs and the server breach records and the physical security data. The picture that emerged was not clean or simple. It had the complicated, layered texture of an operation that had been running for longer than the visible incident suggested, with multiple entry points and more than one objective. This wasn't a single buyer trying to steal a patent. This was something larger, multiple interests, possibly competing, converging on Novatech's technology from different angles. He brought it to Olivia on a Thursday afternoon in the same conference room where they'd first met. He laid it out methodically, without theater, the way he would have briefed a mission to his team. Here's what we know, here's what we can infer, here's what we don't know yet and need to. Olivia listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she took notes in the compressed shorthand way of someone who had spent years processing large amounts of information at speed. Reyes sat to her left. Neither of them spoke until Daniel was finished. The inside contact, Olivia said. You don't think it's Marsh? Marsh was a resource they cultivated under duress. The inside contact is someone who opened that system's administration override. Someone who had access to building credentials and knew how to use them without tripping the standard audit protocols. He paused. Whoever it is, they know your systems well, not engineer level, but operational level. How the security architecture works, where the gaps are. Olivia and Reyes looked at each other briefly. It was the kind of look that didn't need words. The look of two people who had been working together long enough to have a shorthand. Security operations, Reyes said. Not a question. That's where I'd start, Daniel said. Reyes's expression settled into something hard and still. He was being told to look at his own people, and he was experienced enough to know that the instinct to resist that was the most dangerous instinct in this situation. I'll need to do it quietly, he said. If I tip the wrong person... We don't tip anyone, Daniel said. We don't look at personnel files through any channel that goes through security ops. Everything goes through Olivia directly or through me. We pull external records, financial, communication patterns, anything that doesn't route through the in-house system. That'll take time, Reyes said. Then we give it time, Daniel said. Olivia had been quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. When she looked up, her expression had the particular quality he'd seen twice before. That compressed internal focus, processing something she hadn't finished processing yet. Dr. Marsh, she said. What do we do with him in the meantime? He stays in place, Daniel said. He keeps receiving their messages, and he responds the way he's been responding. But he tells us every contact, every request, every detail. They're going to ask him for something again, and when they do, what he gives them is what we decide he gives them. We use him as a channel, Olivia said. We use him as a channel, Daniel agreed, with his knowledge and his consent. He wants out of this. He'll cooperate. Olivia nodded slowly. And the exterior threats, the people who ran the operation at the restaurant, are they connected to the inside contact, or are they a separate track? That's the question I haven't answered yet, Daniel said honestly. The operational style at the restaurant was contract. Professional, but disposable. The kind of people you use when you want distance between yourself and the outcome. The inside contact is much more careful, much more embedded. They might be working for the same principles, or they might be competing organizations converging on the same target. If it's the second scenario, they'll eventually interfere with each other, Olivia said. Or accelerate, Daniel said. Whichever one realizes the other is close to the technology first is going to move faster than they were planning, which means we need to control the pace. Olivia set her pen down. She looked at him with the direct, assessing quality that he'd come to understand was just how she looked at things. Not aggressive, not performative, just the genuine attention of someone who had decided that the world worked better when you looked at it without filters. "How do you do that?" she said. "Control the pace." "You give them something to chase," Daniel said. "You make them think they're closer than they are. You give them a reason to move before they're ready." He paused. "And when they move before they're ready, they make mistakes." The afternoon light had shifted, coming in lower through the conference room windows, and it caught the edge of Olivia's legal pad and the rim of Reyes's coffee cup and the dust that moved in the air above the table in the particular slow way that dust moved in sealed rooms. "You've done this before," Olivia said. "A version of it," Daniel said. "Is it going to work?" He looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "But it's the best option we have." He called Mrs. Petrovich from the parking structure before he left to add an extra hour to the afternoon coverage. Mrs. Petrovich, who was 68 and Croatian and had a voice like a woman who had survived things she had decided not to talk about, said of course, and asked if Ava had mentioned needing new shoes because she'd noticed the left sole on the girl's sneakers was starting to come away. "I'll check," Daniel said. "You should check," Mrs. Petrovich said, and hung up. He drove home the long way. No gray sedan today. He'd been varying his route since the night of the drive from school, which complicated things slightly. It added 7 to 12 minutes to every trip depending on traffic. But nobody had been behind him in the 3 days since. He didn't take that as reassurance. He took it as a sign that they'd assessed what they needed to assess and had stopped using the visible method. He picked up Ava at Mrs. Petrovich's door. She was wearing her backpack on one strap, which meant she was in a good mood, and she had a drawing in her hand that she immediately held up for inspection. It appeared to be a fish of some kind, rendered in orange marker, with an expression that Daniel privately thought was more menacing than she had probably intended. "It's a clownfish," she said. "I can see that," he said, because he loved her. Mrs. Petrovich said it looks like a regular fish. Mrs. Petrovich has different taste. Ava studied the drawing for a moment, then rolled it up carefully and tucked it under her arm. "We're studying ocean ecosystems," she said. "Did you know that clownfish are actually really territorial? They're not friendly like in the movie. They're very aggressive about their anemone." "I didn't know that," Daniel said. "Most people don't." She sounded genuinely sorrowful about this, as though the world's ignorance of clownfish aggression was a problem she was working on solving. "Dad?" "Yeah." "You seem less tired today." He looked at her. She was looking at the elevator buttons, not at him, with the careful nonchalance of someone who had thought about whether to say the thing and decided to say it casually, so it was easier to walk back if he didn't want to talk about it. "Yeah," he said. "I think I might be." She nodded, the single decisive nod of someone who had expected this answer. The elevator opened. They went inside. In the apartment, while Ava did her homework at the kitchen table and narrated it with her usual editorial commentary, Daniel stood at the window with a glass of water and looked at the street below and thought about what Olivia had said as he was leaving the conference room, while Reyes was on the phone, and it was just the two of them for a moment. She'd said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He'd said yes, because he'd known she'd been sitting on it. "When you left the Navy," she'd said, "after everything, was it hard? Deciding that the life you'd been living wasn't the life you wanted anymore?" He'd thought about it. The honest answer was complicated, and the simple answer wasn't quite true, so he'd gone for something in between. "It wasn't hard deciding," he'd said. "The decision was obvious once Sarah was gone and Ava needed a father instead of an operator. The hard part was the first 2 years of being nobody dangerous, just being a person." He'd paused. "There's a specific feeling you lose. Knowing exactly what you're capable of and having that matter day to day. Losing that it's like losing a language you were fluent in. You don't stop knowing it, but nobody around you speaks it anymore. Olivia had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "Do you miss it?" And Daniel had been honest. "Some days," he'd said. "Not the violence, not the risk, just the clarity, knowing exactly what the stakes were and what you were supposed to do about them." She'd nodded at that, slowly, in the way that meant she'd understood something she hadn't had words for before. "That makes sense," she'd said, "more than you probably think." He hadn't asked her what she meant by that. He'd thought about it on the drive over, and he was thinking about it now, at the window with his water glass, listening to Ava explain to herself why fractions were less logical than they were required to be. The stakes were clear here. The situation had been handing them to him, one at a time, since the alley outside Ardent. The four men in the formation, the gray sedan, Marcia's tired, cornered face, the photos of a girl who didn't know she was being photographed. Every piece of it had a shape, and the shapes were beginning to fit together into something he could read, the way terrain eventually resolves from abstract contour lines into actual ground. The inside contact, the competing exterior organizations, Marcia's an unwilling channel, and somewhere above all of it, behind it, the people with enough money and reach to run an operation this layered for this long against a company this well protected. "Dad," Ava said, "what's 11/16 minus 3/8?" He thought about it for a moment. "Convert 3/8 to 16ths first." 6/16? Right. So 11/16 minus 6/16 is 5/16? Yeah? That's not so bad, she said, with the mild surprise of someone who had expected a worse outcome. She wrote it down. "I don't know why fractions are supposed to be hard. Once you know the trick, it's fine." Daniel looked at her, the orange clownfish drawing rolled up on the table beside her, her sneaker with the coming away sole propped on the chair rung underneath her, this small, specific, irreplaceable person who had somehow become the whole center of his life while he was busy trying to keep her safe. "Most things are like that," he said. "Like what?" "Hard until you know the trick. Then just the thing you know how to do." Ava considered this with the seriousness she applied to most abstract observations. "That sounds like something they'd put in a fortune cookie," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." She went back to her fractions. He went back to his water and his window and the street below and the slow, careful construction of a plan that didn't have all its pieces yet but was beginning, at last, to have its shape. 3 blocks away, in a parking structure Daniel did not know about, a man in a dark car sent a brief message on an encrypted channel. The message said, "Ward is deeper in than we anticipated. This changes the timeline." The response came back in under a minute. 1 line. Then move the timeline. The message from the parking structure that Daniel didn't know about had a consequence he felt 3 days later, not as information but as texture. The particular shift in atmosphere that preceded acceleration. The way a room changes when someone who has been patient runs out of patience. The first sign was Marsh. He came to Daniel's desk on a Monday morning looking like a man who had not slept in 2 days, which turned out to be accurate. He sat down in the chair across from Daniel and put his phone on the desk between them, screen up, showing a message that had come through the ghost address channel at 3 in the morning. The message was longer than the previous ones. It had a list of specifics, not data requests this time, but access requirements, physical access. A specific server room on the 28th floor, a specific time window, a specific file path that the message sender wanted manually extracted and transferred to a device that would be left in a location Marsh was to visit the following Wednesday. "They're escalating," Marsh said. His voice had the thin, used quality of someone who had been frightened for so long that the fear had started to eat the edges of everything else. "They've never asked for something physical before. It's always been remote." Daniel read the message twice. "Did you respond?" "I said I needed time, that I had to think about the access logistics." He looked at Daniel. "That's what you told me to say if they escalated." "That's right. You did right." Daniel set the phone down. "The server room they're asking about, what's on that floor?" "The primary research archive. The full battery architecture documentation, not just subsections, everything." Marsh paused. "If they get that, The entire 4 years of work, they're not going to get it, Daniel said. How do you know that? Because we're not going to give it to them, Daniel said. We're going to give them something else. He took the phone to Olivia that afternoon. She read it standing up, which he had noticed was her habit when the information was bad. She processed things better on her feet, moving slightly in place the way people do when they're working through something in their head. When she finished, she set the phone on the conference table and looked at the bay through the glass wall for a moment. "This is the move we've been waiting for," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "And the timing matters. Whoever sent this has moved up their schedule, which means something changed for them externally. They're under pressure from someone above them." "Competing interest," Reyes said from the corner of the room. He'd been quiet since Daniel came in, sitting with his tablet, but his attention had been fully on the conversation. "The exterior group, the one that ran the restaurant operation, if they're making progress independently, then our inside contact needs to move before they get beaten to it," Daniel said. "Right, which means we have less time than we thought to set this up correctly, but it also means they're going to be less careful than they would have been if they weren't rushed." He pulled out his own phone and brought up the notes he'd been building since the first day at his desk. "Here's what I want to do." The plan had 3 components. The first was Marsh. He would respond to the ghost address message and agree to the physical access, but push the timeline by 48 hours, citing a security rotation schedule he needed to work around. Plausible, cautious, consistent with how Marsh had been responding throughout. This would buy them 2 days, and if the message sender bought it, confirm that they were still treating Marsh as a reliable and controllable resource. The second component was the bait. Daniel had spent 2 evenings constructing what Olivia, when she heard it, called quietly brilliant, and Daniel called functional. He'd worked with Marsh to create a document package that looked to anyone with technical knowledge but incomplete context, like the final architecture specifications for the battery system. It had the right file structure, the right naming conventions, the right volume of data. 3/4 of it was genuine. Older research iterations that had already been superseded, documented dead ends, preliminary models that bore no resemblance to the actual final system. But it was real data, real formatting, real enough that it would take a technical team days to realize they'd been given the bones of a building that had already been torn down and rebuilt somewhere else. The third component was the announcement. "This is the part I want to talk you through carefully," Daniel said, looking at Olivia. "Because it requires you to do something that's going to feel wrong. Tell me." "I want you to announce a breakthrough," he said. "Internally. Restricted to senior staff and board members, marked confidential. The kind of announcement that's supposed to stay inside these walls. A preliminary patent filing ahead of the projected schedule. Something that sounds like you finished 18 months early." Olivia looked at him steadily. "And the leak will carry it outside." "Fast," Daniel said. "If our inside contact is in security operations, they have access to internal communications at a level that means they'll have this within hours of it going out. And when they do, they're going to have a problem, because now they have 2 competing pressures. The exterior group will hear the same announcement through whatever channels they're using, and both of them are going to want to move immediately before a patent filing locks down the IP. They'll rush," Reyes said. "They'll make mistakes," Daniel said. "And they'll potentially get in each other's way, which creates a situation where they expose each other," Olivia said. "That's the hope," Daniel said. "It's not guaranteed, but right now we're trying to identify an inside contact we can't see and neutralize an exterior threat we can only partially track. If we can get both of them moving toward the same point at the same time, at a pace they're not comfortable with, we have a much better chance of seeing who they actually are." The room was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was overcast, the bay flat and gray through the window, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether it was going to rain. "What's the risk?" Olivia said. "If the announcement leaks to the wrong external parties before we're ready, press, investors, regulatory bodies, it creates a different problem. You'd have to either confirm it, which is false, or deny it, which undermines your credibility." Daniel paused. "So the list of who gets the announcement has to be very short and very carefully chosen." "How short?" 6 people maximum. You, Reyes, 2 board members you trust completely, your legal counsel, and your head of external communications. Only because you'll need her when this is over, and you need to control the narrative coming out. Olivia nodded slowly. And Marsh? Marsh gets a different version, enough to make his communication to the ghost address credible. He needs to be able to tell them he heard about the announcement through the research team, which is plausible, and that it changes the urgency of what they're asking for. Daniel looked at her. He's scared, but he's committed. He wants his daughter safe. His daughter, Olivia said. We have eyes on her? Since Tuesday, Reyes said. 2 people, rotating. She doesn't know. She's fine. Olivia exhaled. Not dramatically, just a breath that carried weight. She picked up her pen and looked at her legal pad, which had a half-page of notes from the conversation, and then she looked at Daniel. What do you need from me to make this work? The announcement drafted and distributed by tomorrow morning, Daniel said. And I need you to act normally, completely normally. If our inside contact is watching the way people behave in this building, and they will be, any change in how you move through your day is going to register. Normal, she said. Normal, he said. She made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I run a company where 4 people just tried to kidnap me and there's a mole in my security team, she said. I'm going to need a minute to remember what normal looks like. You've been doing it this whole time, Daniel said. You're better at it than you think. She looked at him with the particular expression that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks, that direct, assessing look that had a layer of something else underneath it, something she hadn't named and he hadn't pushed on. Is that a compliment, Mr. Ward? It's an observation, he said. But yes. Well, the announcement went out at 9 the following morning. 6 recipients. Marked confidential, internal distribution only. Olivia had written it herself, in the precise, measured language of someone who had spent years learning how to say significant things without overselling them. It described a successful proof-of-concept test that accelerated the patent timeline by 14 months. It mentioned a filing date 12 days out. It was, as a piece of technical communication, completely convincing, and Daniel, who had read it over her shoulder as she finished it, had told her so. By 11:15, Marsh received a new message on the Ghost channel. He brought his phone to Daniel immediately, coming down the hallway from the lab with the particular controlled urgency of a man who is trying not to run. The message was short. It said, Wednesday is no longer viable. Tonight, same location, same transfer method. Confirm. They got it, Marsh said. They got it, Daniel said. He was already typing a message to Reyes. The next 6 hours were the most concentrated preparation work Daniel had done since leaving the Navy. And there were moments in the middle of it where something in him, the part that had spent years being folded down to fit inside an ordinary life, came awake in a way that felt less like readiness and more like remembering. He didn't let himself examine it too closely. There wasn't time, and examination was a luxury that belonged to after. Reyes pulled 3 members of his team, the ones whose access logs, communication patterns, and financial records had come back clean, and briefed them on a need-to-know basis. Daniel had pushed for minimum exposure. The fewer people who knew the specifics of the operation tonight, the less surface area for a leak. Reyes had agreed, though Daniel could see it cost him something, operating this way in his own domain. Daniel designed the physical setup for the server room himself. The bait package, Marsh's false architecture document, would be staged on a designated workstation on the 28th floor, accessible via the access method Marsh was going to communicate to his contact. The room had 4 entry points, a main corridor door, a secondary maintenance access, a utility conduit that most people didn't know connected to the HVAC service shaft on the floor above, and an emergency egress that hadn't been used in 3 years, and whose alarm had, as of 6 hours ago, been very deliberately not reset after a maintenance test. They'll sweep for obvious coverage, Daniel told Reyes, standing in the server room with a flashlight checking sightlines. Standard protocol if they're professional. And they are. So obvious coverage gives them what they expect to find. What they won't look for is what doesn't look like coverage. Which is? Daniel pointed at 3 locations, a junction box near the primary server rack, a ventilation register near the secondary door, a cable tray overhead. There, and there. Passive sensors, no visible hardware. They'll find the obvious cameras we leave running because if there are no cameras, that's wrong too. They won't find these. Reyes looked at the 3 locations. Where'd you learn to think like this? From people who were very good at getting into places they weren't supposed to be, Daniel said. Pay attention to how that kind of person thinks, and you get good at anticipating them. And the exterior group? The one from the restaurant? If they're tracking the same announcement through their own channels, they'll have a different access plan. They're not coming through Marsh, they're coming through whatever entry point their inside contact, which may be a different inside contact, has given them. Daniel looked at the server room layout, which means we might have 2 separate teams trying to access the same floor tonight from different directions. That's a significant problem, Reyes said. It's also our best evidence, Daniel said. If they arrive separately and independently and both of them are going for the same data, that tells us something we can take to people with legal authority. It's not just corporate espionage anymore. It's coordinated theft with multiple parties. Different jurisdiction, different weight. FBI, Reyes said. At minimum, Daniel said. I've already drafted a summary. It goes to the field office tonight regardless of what happens in this room, as a precaution. Olivia signed off on it this afternoon. Reyes looked at him for a moment. You thought of a lot of contingencies. I think of contingencies, Daniel said. It's a thing I do. Atsem. He called Mrs. Petrovic at 4 o'clock and asked her to keep Ava overnight. He told her it was a work thing, which was true in a way that he hoped his voice didn't complicate. Mrs. Petrovic said of course, in the tone of a woman who had noticed several things over the past 2 weeks and had decided that they were not her business to ask about. She said Ava had eaten well and had spent an hour teaching her Croatian neighbor's dog a trick involving a tennis ball, with mixed results. She's a good girl, Mrs. Petrovic said. Yeah, Daniel said. She is. He hung up and sat in the car in the parking structure for 3 minutes. He was aware of his own heartbeat in the way you became aware of it when things were about to move. Not fast, not panicked, just present, each beat a small reminder that the machinery was running. He had done this before, or versions of it. He knew how the body behaved in the hours before something real, and he knew that the feeling didn't mean something was wrong. It meant something was about to require everything he had, and the body was being honest about it. He went back upstairs. Olivia was still in the building. He'd expected her to be somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere that wasn't a location that might shortly have hostile personnel moving through it. But she was in her office on the 34th floor, working, and when he came to the doorway, she looked up without surprise. You should go home, he said. I'm aware, she said. I'm going to in about an hour. I'd prefer now. I'm sure you would. She set her pen down and leaned back in her chair, and in the lamplight of her office, she had a standing lamp in the corner that she used instead of the overhead, which he had noticed on his first visit and had filed as the kind of small personal preference that told you something about a person. She looked tired in a real way, not the performed tiredness of someone who wanted you to know they were working hard, but the actual tiredness of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Tell me how tonight is going to go, he told her. Not all of it. Not the contingency paths, not the specific positions, not the things she didn't need to know and that knowing would only make harder to sit with. But the shape of it, the bait, the sensors, the coverage, the FBI contact on standby. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. And if it doesn't work the way you're planning, she said, then we learn something from how it doesn't work and we adjust, he said. There's no scenario where tonight is wasted, even if it doesn't go exactly right. That's a very measured way to look at it. It's the only useful way, he said. The alternative is being attached to a specific outcome, and that gets people hurt. She looked at him for a moment. The lamp in the corner put most of her face in soft shadow, and he thought, not for the first time and with the same slightly uncomfortable awareness, that she was a genuinely remarkable person, not in the way that magazines describe people as remarkable, which was always a flattening, a reduction, but in the specific and complicated sense that she had built something real and was fighting to protect it and was doing it with a clarity of purpose that was, in his experience, genuinely uncommon. Daniel, she said, It was the first time she'd used his first name without it following a title or a formal opener. He noticed it, and she noticed that he noticed it, and neither of them made it a thing. "What happened in your last mission?" she said. "The one that changed everything. You don't have to tell me, but I've been trying to understand why you, how someone comes through what you clearly came through and becomes the person you are now." He looked at the lamp in the corner for a moment. The question deserved a real answer, and he tried to find one that was true without being longer than the truth needed to be. "We were in a situation where the mission objective and the right thing to do were in direct conflict," he said. "Not gray area, not ambiguous, just clean, clear conflict. Some of the team followed the objective. I pulled 2 men to follow me, and we did the right thing instead." He paused. "We saved 11 civilian lives. We lost the objective. And when we got home, the people who followed the objective were fine, and the people who went with me were facing serious consequences." He stopped again. "It got resolved, eventually. But in the process of resolving it, I understood something. I understood that the structure I'd been operating inside for 8 years wasn't built to protect the same things I was trying to protect. That the gap between those two things could, under the wrong circumstances, become very large very fast." Olivia was quiet. "So I left," he said. "And then Sarah died, and I had Ava, and I stopped asking myself big questions for a while. The small ones were enough. They were more than enough." "And now?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Now I'm asking both," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, direct, no performance, and then she nodded once and picked up her pen. "Go do what you need to do," she said. "I'll be out of here in 45 minutes. Reyes is sending a car." "I know. He told me 4 times." Daniel left her office. He went down to the 28th floor and he checked everything again. The sensors, the positions, the sight lines, the egress, and then he found his own position in a maintenance corridor off the primary server room that had a slatted vent panel with a direct line of sight to the room's main access point and enough shadow that he was effectively invisible to anyone coming through the door. He settled in. He checked his phone. One message from Reyes, confirmation that the exterior team was in position. One message from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be Marsh, sent from a different device as instructed. "Contact confirmed. Says tonight at 11:30. Bringing somebody. That was new. Daniel read it twice and sent a single word back to Reyes. "Adjust." The building settled into the particular quiet of a large structure after hours. The HVAC cycling, the distant mechanical hum of server equipment, the occasional creak of the floor above. Daniel sat in the dark corridor and breathed slowly and did not think about Ava, because thinking about Ava was a thing he did before and after, but not during. During, she lived in a specific closed room in his chest, and he kept the door shut and trusted her to the safety of what he was doing right now, and to Mrs. Petrovic's and to the ordinary, improbable luck that had kept both of them intact so far. At 11:18, the first alert came from Reyes. Motion on the east stairwell, 27th floor, 2 individuals. At 11:24, a second alert. Utility access on the building's north side, ground level, method consistent with professional bypass. 2 entry points. 2 separate teams, different routes, different methods, same destination. Daniel closed his eyes for 3 seconds. He thought about the timeline on the message in the parking structure. Then moved the timeline. He thought about the ghost address message telling Marsh to bring someone. He thought about the specific, careful architecture of a plan that had just confirmed what he'd theorized but hadn't been certain of until this moment. There wasn't one inside contact. There were 2 operations converging, one that had been running for months through Marsh, embedded and patient, and a second one that had accelerated in the past week because the first one was taking too long. 2 organizations, both after the same technology, both with inside access, both reaching the endpoint at the same time because neither knew the other existed, and both had been spooked by the same fake announcement into moving tonight. He opened his eyes. He pulled out his radio and pressed the transmit. "Reyes," he said quietly, "we have 2 separate teams, independent operation, same objective, no coordination with each other. Do not let them reach each other. If they realize each other is here, they burn everything and run. Keep them separated until we have both in containment." A pause. Then Reyes's voice, controlled and steady. Copy. How do you want to stage it? Let them both reach 28. Give them time to find each other's presence, then close it. That's cutting it close. I know, Daniel said. But we need them to see each other. That's the evidence. That's what makes this unambiguous. Two separate hostile parties inside a secured facility converging on classified proprietary data. That's not corporate civil dispute territory. That's federal territory. Another pause. Understood. Holding positions. Daniel sat in the dark corridor and waited. At 11:41, the server room door opened. The man who came through was not Marsh. He was mid-40s, medium build, moving with the practiced economy of someone who had done this kind of work before. He had a small device in his hand, a data transfer unit of the kind that could pull a file package in under a minute. And he was already scanning the room as he came through the door, checking sightlines, checking for obvious coverage, which he found, and registering that it was there, which was correct, and concluding that it was the expected level of coverage, which was what Daniel had intended him to conclude. He moved to the designated workstation. He found the bait package. He began the transfer. At 11:44, the secondary door on the far side of the server room opened. The man who came through that door was younger, early 30s, and he was accompanied by a second person, the somebody Marsh's contact had mentioned. They came through the door 2 steps apart, moving in a 2-person formation that spoke to a different kind of training than the first man, and they stopped immediately when they registered that someone else was already in the room. The 3 of them looked at each other. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. That specific, concentrated silence of 3 people who all knew exactly what they were doing in a room they weren't supposed to be in, all understanding simultaneously that the situation they'd walked into was not the situation they'd been told to expect. In that silence, Daniel could feel the moment when all 3 of them reached the same conclusion by separate routes. Abort, run, burn the operation. He pressed the transmit. Now, he said. The lights in the server room came on at full brightness. All 4 entry points sealed simultaneously. Magnetic locks engaging with a sound like a single firm word. And through the vent panel, Daniel watched 3 men who had been professionally calm for 4 seconds become something much less controlled, moving toward exits that weren't there anymore, checking phones that had just entered a signal-blocked zone. In the hallway outside, he could hear Reyes's team moving into position. Daniel stood up in the maintenance corridor. He stretched his back, which had stiffened slightly in the hour of waiting. He picked up his radio. All 3 are contained, Reyes said. His voice had the flat, precise quality of a man who was extremely relieved and was not going to show it until later. FBI contact is already inbound, estimated 20 minutes. Good, Daniel said. There's something else, Reyes said. His voice had shifted slightly, not uncertain, but careful. The way someone is careful when they have information they've only just assembled into its full shape. The second team's secondary access point, the one on the north side of the building, the bypass method. We pulled the internal security records for who had knowledge of that specific access point and its bypass vulnerability. Daniel waited. It's Harlan Voss, Reyes said. The name landed with a weight that was disproportionate to its 2 words. Harlan Voss had been Novatech's chief of security for 6 years. He was Reyes's predecessor, technically, the man who had built the security architecture of this building from the ground up. He had retired 8 months ago with a ceremony and a speech about institutional loyalty and a gift from the board. He had shaken Reyes's hand on his last day and told him the building was in good hands. He had known every access point, every vulnerability, every gap that had been documented and undocumented because he had created them. And he had sold that knowledge, along with apparently a few active credentials he'd kept past his retirement date, to someone who had paid well enough to be worth his 6 years of loyalty to Novatech. Voss, Daniel said. Voss? Reyes confirmed. There was something in his voice that was harder to name than relief or in anger, something older and quieter, the specific exhaustion of a man who had trusted something and found that the trust had been held in bad faith. Where is he now? The FBI will want to know that answer, Reyes said. We're already pulling. Daniel stood in the maintenance corridor for a moment. The server room on the other side of the vent panel was still locked, still lit, 3 men inside it who were now sitting with the practical weight of what having nowhere to go actually felt like. In 20 minutes, the building would have federal agents in it. In some number of hours that he couldn't predict, the shape of the last several weeks would exist as documentation rather than suspicion, as evidence rather than theory. He thought about the gray sedan that had stopped following him 3 days in. He thought about Marsh's hands, unsteady around his coffee mug. He thought about the 4 men in the service alley outside Ardent, and the talker's phone call completing before Daniel took the weapon away, and the specific patience with which whatever was now ending had been moving toward this building for months before he was ever part of it. He walked down the maintenance corridor to the stairwell and climbed 1 flight to the 29th floor, to the lab where Marsh spent his days, because he'd told Marsh to wait there and he needed to tell him in person that it was over, or as over as things got before the paperwork began and the people in suits arrived and the long process of aftermath claimed everything that the operational part had resolved. Marsh was at his workstation. He hadn't been working. His screen was dark, and he was sitting in his chair with his hands folded on his desk, still, like a man who had been sitting in a particular quality of quiet for a long time. He looked up when Daniel came in. "Well," he said. His voice had the fragile quality of someone who had been holding a very specific hope for a very long time. "It's done," Daniel said. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his face in his hands, and his shoulders moved, and Daniel stood in the doorway of the lab and did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and because some things needed their moment without commentary. After a while, Marsh lifted his head. His eyes were red. He looked embarrassed about it, which Daniel thought was unnecessary but understood. "My daughter," Marsh said. "She's fine," Daniel said. "She's going to keep being fine. Our people will stay on her until this is fully processed and we're confident there's no residual risk. That's going to be a few days, maybe a week. But Dr. Marsh, she's safe." Marsh nodded. He nodded for a long time, the repetitive nod of a man letting something release from his chest that had been lodged there for months. "Thank you," he said. Daniel nodded once and left him there, and went down to the lobby to meet the FBI. The FBI spent 11 days inside Novatech. They came in quietly the first night, 4 agents, then 8, then a full task force by the end of the first week. And they moved through the building with the methodical, unhurried thoroughness of people who understood that the work that happened after the dramatic moment was the work that actually mattered. They interviewed staff. They pulled server records. They traced the ghost address channel that had been used to pressure Marsh and found it routed through 3 countries before terminating at a server farm outside Vienna, which pointed toward an organization that 2 of the agents, when they thought nobody was listening, referred to by an abbreviation Daniel recognized from briefings he'd sat in 7 years ago and had assumed he'd never have reason to think about again. The 2 men who had come through the secondary door in the server room turned out to be contracted through a private intelligence firm with offices in 4 cities and no website. The man who had come through the main door, the one who had started the bait transfer, was harder to place. He had 3 passports in his bag, none of them in the same name, and he declined to speak to anyone, including his own attorney, for the first 72 hours. The FBI agent who briefed Daniel on this, a compact woman named Spears, who had the focused, slightly impatient energy of someone who was always 3 steps ahead of the current conversation, said that the silence itself was informative. People who won't talk in the first 72 hours are either protecting someone above them or waiting for someone above them to make a decision about how exposed they want to be, Spears said. Usually both. "And Voss?" Daniel said. Spears's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled. "Mr. Voss was apprehended at San Francisco International Airport at 6:40 the morning after your operation. He had a one-way ticket to Lisbon and enough cash in his carry-on to constitute a reporting violation on its own." She paused. "He's talking, considerably." Harlan Voss, it turned out, had been talking to the wrong people for almost 2 years. Since before his retirement, which reframed the retirement itself as a calculated positioning rather than the graceful exit it had been presented as. He had sold access credentials, building vulnerability data, staff schedules, and security protocol documentation in exchange for payments routed through a shell company that the FBI's financial forensics team described with visible professional satisfaction as among the more elaborate structures they'd recently encountered. The payments had funded a life in Lisbon that Voss had been constructing quietly for 18 months. An apartment, a boat, the patient architecture of a disappearance. He had not anticipated that the thing he'd sold access to would have someone like Daniel Ward standing inside it on the night he'd planned to use it. Spears told Daniel this in the lobby of Novatech on the fourth day of the investigation, while the building moved around them with the particular charged energy of a place that had been shaken and was still settling. She told him matter-of-factly the way professionals communicated to each other when the performance wasn't necessary, and then she looked at him with the direct, measuring look that Daniel had noticed in her from their first conversation. "You did good work here," she said. "I did what the situation required," Daniel said. "Most people, the situation required them to stand in an alley and watch," she said. "You made different choices throughout. I'm noting that for what it's worth." Daniel nodded. He wasn't sure what it was worth. He'd think about that later, maybe. Or he wouldn't. Some things didn't require their worth to be calculated. He went home that afternoon and picked up Ava from school himself. The first time in a week he'd been the one at the curb when the doors opened. She came out with her backpack on both straps, which usually meant tired. But when she saw him, she switched it to one strap, which was her version of recalibrating her presentation mid-approach, and she walked to the car with the studied casualness of a 9-year-old who had decided she wasn't going to show how much she'd missed him picking her up. She got in. She put on her seatbelt. She looked out the windshield for a moment. "Mrs. Petrovic said you were doing something important," she said. "Yeah," he said. "She wouldn't say what." "No, she wouldn't." Ava was quiet for another moment. They pulled out of the pickup line and into the afternoon traffic, which was its usual grinding self, and the radio was off and the city moved around them, and Daniel drove and breathed and felt, for the first time in 11 days, the specific quality of ordinary that he had spent 7 years learning to value. "Are you okay?" Ava said. "I'm fine," he said. "You always say that." "It's usually true." She turned to look at him with the particular direct attention that she had always had, since she was 3 years old, this habit of looking at people as though she had decided to actually see them rather than just look in their direction. Her mother's eyes, dark and serious, in a face that was still working out what it was going to be. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I know you do things that are... I know that you know how to do things other people don't know how to do." She said it carefully, choosing each word, which meant she had been thinking about how to say it for a while. "I don't need you to tell me what. I just want to know that when you do those things, you're okay after." He looked at the road for a moment. He thought about what it meant that his 9-year-old had worked her way to this sentence by herself, in the quiet of Mrs. Petrovic's apartment over the past week, while he was sitting in a maintenance corridor in the dark, waiting for 2 teams of professionals to walk into a room they couldn't leave. "I'm okay after," he said. "Okay," she said. "Are you okay?" he said. She considered this seriously, which was the only way she considered things. "Mrs. Petrovich taught me to make palachinka," she said. "They're like crepes, but Croatian. I think I'm pretty good at them." "Yeah?" "I burned the first 2, she said. "But then I figured out the heat thing, and the last 4 were really good." She said I'm a natural, but I think she was being encouraging. The second to last one had a weird shape. "Weird shapes still taste the same," Daniel said. "That's true," Ava said, with the tone of someone filing this away as a useful philosophical position. He made dinner that night, real dinner, the lemon chicken again because she'd asked for it specifically, with the rice and the good bread from the bakery 2 blocks over that he didn't go to often enough. They ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the window open to let in the evening, which still had the cold edge of a San Francisco spring even in April. And Ava told him about a disagreement she'd had with a girl at school about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs, a debate she had clearly won on the merits and was still processing with the specific energy of someone who had been right but hadn't fully enjoyed it. She said dogs because they can learn tricks, Ava said, but dolphins can learn tricks and also solve problems they've never been trained for. That's a completely different category. "You're right," Daniel said. "I know," she said. "She didn't think I was being mean, did she? I wasn't trying to be mean. I just knew the answer." "Knowing the answer isn't mean," he said. "How you say it can be, but knowing it isn't." Ava thought about this. "I think I said it okay," she said, with the slight uncertainty of someone who was genuinely reviewing their own conduct. I didn't say she was wrong. I just said, here's some more information. That sounds fine. Okay. She ate her rice. Dad? Yeah. Ms. Miller called the house today. I answered because I thought it might be you. Daniel set down his fork. She called the house. On the landline. I didn't know we still had a landline. Ava looked at him with mild curiosity. She said to tell you she was sorry for calling the house, and she got the number from the restaurant's employee records, which she knows is a little weird, and she wanted to know if you were okay because nobody had heard from you today. She said, Ava paused, recalling precisely. She said she was sorry for the disruption to your life and that she hoped things were getting back to normal. He looked at his daughter. He thought about Olivia using the word normal and almost smiled at the way it landed. What did you say? He said. I said you were fine and you were making chicken, Ava said. She said that sounded good. She sounded nice. Ava looked at him with the particular careful expression of someone who had a follow-up question and was deciding whether to ask it. Is she a friend? Daniel thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated by the fact that he wasn't entirely sure what the categories were anymore, which itself was information. She's someone I've been working with, he said. She's a good person. Yeah. Ava studied him for a moment with her mother's eyes. Then she went back to her chicken. Okay, she said, in the tone that meant she was noting the answer and reserving the right to return to the subject later. He called Olivia the next morning from his car before he drove to Novatech for what Spears had told him would be one of the last formal debriefing sessions. She picked up on the second ring. Ava said you called, he said. I did. A pause. I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't have gone through the employee file. It's your company's file, he said, and it's fine. She seems like a good kid. She is, he said. She told me she won a debate about dolphins. Did she win? She was right, so yes. A short silence, the comfortable kind rather than the uncertain kind, which was something that had developed somewhere in the middle of the past 3 weeks without either of them formally noticing. How are you doing? Olivia said. Actually, he said, I'm tired. But it's the kind of tired that means something's finished rather than the kind that means something's wrong. I'm okay. The FBI said the Voss situation is going to take months to fully process, she said. The exterior organizations, the ones that sent the teams, it's going to be complex, multiple jurisdictions. Spears said potentially 2 to 3 years before there are any definitive legal outcomes. That's usually how it goes, he said. The night is fast. Everything after is slow. Does that bother you? No, he said. The night is the part that mattered. The rest is other people's job. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the ambient sound of her office, the HVAC, the faint hum of the city through the glass walls, the everyday sound of a place that was still standing because the right things had happened at the right time. I want to ask you something, she said. And you can say no, and it won't. It doesn't change anything about how I think about what you did, or about anything. Ask, he said. I've been thinking about the security operation here, she said. Not just the current situation, long term. Reyes is excellent, but this month showed me that what I have isn't sufficient for what I'm building. The technology, the patents, the people working on it. It needs something more than a standard corporate security model. She paused. I want someone who thinks the way you think, who sees the way you see. I want to offer you a position, Chief Security Officer. Not a contract, not a consultant arrangement. A real position, built around how you actually operate. He looked out the windshield at the parking structure's concrete levels. He thought about the desk in the windowless room adjacent to security operations where he'd spent his first 2 days reading access logs. He thought about the server room in the dark and the 3 men who'd run out of exits. He thought about Marcia's daughter, safe at Berkeley, not knowing any of it. What does it look like, Weiss? He said. The position. You build it, she said. That's the honest answer. I know what I need in terms of outcome. I don't know the shape of what gets me there, and I think you do. I would need flexibility, he said. For Ava. School pickups, her schedule, the things that don't move. I know, she said. Non-negotiable. Those were your words, and I'm using them back at you. Hours, he said. I won't do this if it requires the kind of commitment that means I'm never home. You'd build the position, she said again, which means you'd build the hours too. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Karen and the antacid tin and the pasta from the staff meal eaten in the break room. He thought about table 15, the last check of the night that had started all of this, carrying it out the same way he'd carried every check at Ardent, quietly, precisely, without drama. He didn't feel nostalgic for it exactly. He felt something more complicated than nostalgic, something like respect for the life he'd built inside those 14 months, the discipline of making the small things matter when the small things were all there was. That life had not been a lesser version of something else. It had been exactly what it needed to be for as long as it needed to be it. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. He went to the debriefing. He sat in a conference room with Spears and 2 other agents and Reyes and answered questions for 3 hours with the patience of a man who understood that the work of after was the work of after, and it had to be done correctly even when it was less interesting than what preceded it. He signed things. He reviewed things. He told them what he knew in the order he knew it, clearly and without embellishment. And when they asked questions he didn't have answers to, he said so without apology. Spears walked him out at the end. In the lobby, before he went through the doors, she stopped him. One thing, she said. Yeah. The operation you ran 8 years ago, she said. The civilians. 11 people. He looked at her. He hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone here, and it was in the classified section of his record, which meant she had access that went beyond what he'd expected from a field office operation. I read your file, she said. The whole thing, not the redacted version. Okay, he said. The people in the room who reviewed that operation made the wrong call, she said. About you and your men. I want you to know there are people in this building who know that. She paused. That's all. He nodded once. He went through the doors. He stood on the sidewalk outside Novatech in the April morning with the city moving around him. Taxis, a construction crew 2 blocks over, someone walking a dog that had decided the hydrant on the corner was the most important thing in the world. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. He stood in it and let it be ordinary and felt the weight of the past 3 weeks sitting on his shoulders in a way that was not unpleasant. The weight of something real, something that had mattered, something that had cost something, and therefore meant something. He thought about what Spears had said. He thought about a room full of people years ago making a wrong call, and the years that had followed, and Ava eating cereal for dinner when he was too tired to cook, and the pasta in the break room at Ardent, and the alley, and the wine bottle, and the 4 men, and Marcia's hands around his coffee mug, and Olivia saying, then move the timeline. He thought about what it meant that the world had come looking for him in an alley outside a restaurant, and that he had met it without entirely meaning to, and that the meeting had turned out to require exactly what he was, not the waiter, not the seal, but the specific combination of everything he'd been and was still, the version of himself that had spent 7 years being a father first and had not lost a single one of the other things in the process of doing it. He started walking to his car. And 6 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon that was genuinely warm by San Francisco standards, Olivia came to dinner. It had been Ava's idea originally, or at least Ava had been the one to make it concrete. She had heard Olivia mentioned enough times in the past month, in phone calls Daniel took at the kitchen table, in references he made to things that had happened at the new office, in the particular way his voice changed register when her name came up, which Ava had noted with the quiet forensic attention she applied to everything, and had announced one morning before school that it seemed like the obvious next step was to invite her over. For what? Daniel had said. Dinner, Ava said. Normal people have people over for dinner. We're normal people. Then invite her for dinner, Ava said, and picked up her backpack and went to wait by the door. He had given it 2 more weeks before doing it, which he was aware was longer than necessary, but which felt like the right pace for reasons he didn't examine too closely. Olivia had said yes immediately, without the pause of someone checking a schedule, which told him she'd been waiting for it without quite knowing how to say so. She arrived at 6:30 with wine in a small wrapped thing she handed to Ava at the door. which turned out to be a book about marine biology that she had purchased after a phone call 2 weeks ago in which Daniel had mentioned, offhandedly, Ava's passionate position on dolphin intelligence. Ava looked at the book. She looked at Olivia. She looked at the book again. "There's a whole chapter on problem-solving behavior," Olivia said, with the slightly careful energy of someone who had put thought into a gift and was now experiencing the standard vulnerability of finding out whether the thought landed. "I know," Ava said. "I've seen this one. I don't have it, though." She clutched it with both hands. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Olivia said. Ava looked at her father in the doorway with an expression that communicated, efficiently and without words, that she approved and that he should not ruin this. He took the wine. He let Olivia in. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Ava did her homework, where Daniel had sat in the dark 2 months ago and made the decision to send Reyes a list of conditions, where the ordinary machinery of their life ran its daily maintenance. He had made the lemon chicken again, partly because it was what he made when things were good, and partly because Ava had campaigned for it specifically on the grounds that it had been Ms. Miller's idea to begin with, which was not technically accurate, but which Ava had decided to believe for narrative purposes. The conversation was easy in the slightly effortful way that first dinners always were, not strained, just the natural friction of 3 people learning how to be in a room together on purpose instead of by circumstance. Ava drove most of it, which neither Daniel nor Olivia had anticipated, and both had quietly appreciated, because Ava asked genuine questions and listened to the answers with her full attention and had no interest in small talk, which meant the conversation kept ending up somewhere real without anyone having to force it there. She asked Olivia what it was like to be in charge of a company. Olivia said it was mostly making decisions with incomplete information and hoping your reasoning was better than your blind spots. Ava considered this and said that sounded like a lot of things. Olivia said yes, it turned out to be. She asked Olivia how she had met Daniel. Olivia said through work. Ava looked at her father for a moment, and Daniel said yes, through work, and Ava nodded with the expression of someone who understood that this was the sanctioned version of the answer and was choosing to accept it. After dinner, after Ava had been sent to get ready for bed, with the usual negotiated extension of 20 minutes that she used to read her new marine biology book, Daniel and Olivia sat at the kitchen table with the remaining wine and the comfortable quiet of an apartment in the evening, and outside the window the city was doing what it always did. Lit up, moving, indifferent, producing its constant low hum of ongoing life. "She's extraordinary," Olivia said. "She is," Daniel said. "She has your way of looking at things," Olivia said. "That stillness, like she's taking everything in before she decides what to do with it." Daniel looked at his wine glass. "Her mother was the talker," he said. "I think Ava got the best of both." Olivia was quiet for a moment in the way that she was quiet when she was letting something sit rather than filling it. It was one of the things he had come to appreciate about her, that she knew the difference between silence that needed to be broken and silence that needed to be respected. "I know I said the CSO position could be built around how you operate," she said, "and I meant it, but I want to ask you directly. Does it feel like the right thing? Not for the company, for you." He thought about the honest answer because she had consistently earned honest answers. "I think so," he said. "I've been at it for 6 weeks now, and it doesn't feel like something I'm doing because it's available. It feels like something I'm doing because it's right for where I am." He paused. "Which is new. Most things I've done in the last 7 years I did because they were sufficient. This feels different." "Different how?" "Sufficient means you're not losing ground," he said. "This feels like, not winning, exactly. More like being where you're supposed to be," which sounds like something from a fortune cookie. Olivia smiled, not the half smile she'd managed in the first weeks, the one that went only partway before it stopped, but a real one, the kind that changed her whole face and made her look younger than she was, and less composed and more human, and considerably more like the person she actually was beneath all the composure. "Your daughter said the same thing to me about fortune cookies." "She's heard me say it before," he said. "It's a good saying," Olivia said, "even if it belongs in a fortune cookie." He looked at her across the kitchen table. In the light of the overhead he'd turned down slightly so it wasn't harsh. In the apartment he had made into a home one unremarkable evening at a time, over 7 years of being exactly what Ava needed and slowly, without planning it, becoming something more than that again. He thought about what it meant to be seen by someone, Jim, not in the dramatic sense, not the sense of a revelation, but in the ordinary, everyday sense of a person who looked at you and processed who you actually were and then kept looking anyway. Sarah had done that, and losing it had been one of the losses inside the larger loss that he had never found a way to fully articulate. He hadn't expected to find it again. He hadn't been looking for it. He was aware, in the quiet way he was aware of most things, that it had found him instead. He was also aware that he was a person with significant complications, a daughter who was his first loyalty, a history that surfaced unexpectedly, a way of living that had been built around self-sufficiency because self-sufficiency was what had been required, and that whatever this was, whatever it was going to be, would need to accommodate all of that, or it would not work. He was too old and too honest to pretend otherwise, and he thought Olivia was too, which was part of what made the sitting at the kitchen table feel like solid ground rather than something he was just hoping held his weight. He didn't say any of this out loud, because it was more than the evening needed, and also because Ava chose that moment to come back from her room in her pajamas, with her marine biology book and a glass of water she hadn't had before and had clearly acquired as a social pretext. "I just wanted to say goodnight," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway with elaborate casualness. "Good night," Daniel said. "Good night, Ava," Olivia said. Ava looked at the two of them at the kitchen table with the assessing expression of someone conducting a final review. Whatever she found in it seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, the small, decisive nod that was entirely her own, and said, "Okay," and went back to her room. Daniel looked at Olivia. Olivia looked at Daniel. "Okay," Olivia said quietly, the word carrying a different weight than when Ava had said it, but not entirely different. "Yeah," he said. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, carrying its millions of ordinary lives forward through the ordinary dark, each one its own complete world, none of them simple, all of them mattering more than they appeared to from a distance. There are people who believe that a life has a shape, that you can look at the arc of it and find the logic, the reason one thing led to another. Daniel Ward had not been one of those people for a long time. He had learned, the hard way, and more than once, that the shape of a life was mostly retrospective. You couldn't see it while you were living it, could only see it in the looking back, and even then the shape was something you assembled from fragments, rather than something that had been waiting to be discovered. But sitting in that kitchen, with Ava in her room reading about dolphins, and Olivia across the table and the city outside the window doing what cities did, he thought that maybe the thing people meant when they talked about a life having a shape wasn't about destiny or design. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the accumulation of choices made in the direction of the things that mattered. The decision in an alley to step through a door, the conditions typed in the dark, the moment in a server room corridor when you said now and trusted that the preparation was sufficient. He had spent 7 years becoming a person who showed up. For Ava's school, for the kitchen table, for the cereal dinners when he was too tired for the real thing, for the morning lunches packed with peanut butter and apple slices and the small bag of pretzels that were her current favorite. He had thought that showing up was a smaller life than the one he'd lived before. He understood now that he had been wrong about that in a way that mattered. Showing up day after day for the people who needed you to, that was not the lesser version of a life. That was the whole point. What had changed was only this. The circle of people he was showing up for had gotten larger, and that, it turned out, felt less like complication and more like the thing that had been missing from the foundation without him knowing there was a missing piece. He poured the last of the wine, half a glass each, barely enough to count. "I should probably go," Olivia said, not moving. "Probably," he agreed, not moving either. The kitchen light was low and steady. In the other room, the quiet rustle of Ava turning a page. Outside, the city. Inside, the small, solid, imperfect life that Daniel Ward had built with his hands and was still building, one ordinary evening at a time, towards something he couldn't fully name yet, but no longer needed to. That was enough. More than enough. It was, if he was being honest, and he had decided some time ago that honesty was the only policy that didn't eventually cost more than it saved, it was everything.